Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about Jeremiah.
But not again until the second day of Rosh Hashanah.
That's right, Rick. We're on a long Isaiah streak, which started last week and will continue through to Rosh Hashanah. I'm Larry Herman, and usually I have a glass of very fine wine when I'm joined by my good friend, the king of Consolation, Rick Muller. But this week, my cup runneth over.
Your cup runneth over. You drunk already?
Drunk with love and affection, which has been coming in my direction.
You got to explain that, sir.
Rick, this week I'm joined by my granddaughter, Millie. Here she is, live and ready to help her Zadie dive into the Haftarah for Shabbat Nachamu,
Yay.
the first of the 7 Haftarot of Consolation.
So I guess you're getting tons of comfort just holding her. So reading Isaiah is just the cherry on top.
Rick, after listening to Echa this past week, we could all use some comfort, and she gives me a lot of comfort. There, let's see if we can get her to smile. Can you smile for Zadie? Say, hi, Zadie. Yeah, there you go. No, get a smile over there.
Kinda.
But she's a happy girl.
Yes.
Let's see if she'll sit for a couple of minutes while we talk a little Haftarah. She's like the opposite of Echa this past week.
Exactly.
That text is brutal and graphic. Clearly, it's the depressing point of the year's cycle of cheerful holidays and commemorative days. But now we start back toward happier days as we approach the Yamim Noraim, or the high holidays. And Isaiah sets us on the right path right from the start.
Can't go wrong with Isaiah, is what I always say.
Yeah, but which Isaiah?
Isaiah the prophet, of course.
Not so simple, Rick or Millie. Remember that last week I told you that the verses that we read from the first chapter of Isaiah for the last Haftarah of admonition were probably written around the time of the Assyrian invasion that saw the conquest and dispersal of the northern kingdom of Israel.
You did indeed.
This week, we skipped to chapter 40 of Isaiah. And although the language may sound similar, most scholars think that the time frame is a century or two later, either following the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem or even around the time of the return of the exiles under the Persians.
Man, Isaiah saw it all.
He did. And I'll tell you what, we're going to let Millie see another view. Say goodbye to Rick and goodbye to the viewers. Be back later.
Good job, Millie.
Anyways, as I said, Isaiah saw it all. Or you said that. But
right.
That's unlikely. More likely, there were 3 different Isaiahs. And although I'm no biblical scholar, I know that most think that chapter 40 is the first chapter written by Deutero Isaiah, the second Isaiah.
Deutero Shmutero. All I know is that this dude could write, or the team of dudes could write. There's some good stuff here.
I agree. Really good stuff. And a bit like last week, quite condensed and even sparse. This Isaiah wrote in relatively short verses with a fair amount of rhyme, alliteration, and repeating words.
You mean like the very first verse? Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami.
Exactly. The repetition of Nachamu is the first of 5 repetitions throughout the Haftarah. In verses 3 and 6, we have the word kol starting the verses.
Good observation. Kol is a trigger word for people to wake up, listen to the voice, the sound.
Right? Okay. And how about the triple repetition of hine at the end of verse 9 and the beginning of verse 10?
Yes, another good one there.
And how about the 2 uses of hein in verse 15, both at the beginning and after the nachta in the middle of the verse?
Very poetic. The alliteration helps links the verses together.
Okay, here's one you have to admire. Hello.
Hello, who's there?
No, Rick, not hello, but hello. In verse 21, the 4 times repetition of the question word hello. Can you read that verse?
Yes, hello, tedu, hello, tishma'u, hello, hugad merosh lachem, hello, avinotem, mostot haaretz.
We'll talk about that later again. And one more triple, Rick. The word af is repeated thrice in verse 24, a simple adverb.
I agree with you. There's some terrific poetic repetition here, but I'm also all about the trope.
I know you are, Rick. So what do you have for us this week? What's your trope of the week?
Well, last week, the trope were pretty simple in keeping with the verses, mainly mapach pashtaz, merchat tibchaz. So this week is the same as last. For the trope of the week, I'm going to choose yativ. There's 2 of them. They're rare. They both fall on one of your repeated words, first in verse 6, and then again in verse 24. Kol the first time, off the second time.
That's interesting. Why the yativ and what is its significance?
Well, yativ is a dramatic, it's a high-pitched, it stands out, it's a calling. It's not your run-of-the-mill mapach pashta in that situation before the zakef katan, but it's a yativ, it's up, it's however you do it, whatever the variations are, it's supposed to stand out. And it does here, especially in verse 6, a voice rings out, proclaim. So the Aharon ben Asher, the Masoretes, they put the trope to match the words to proclaim.
Wow. I especially like the way you do it. Some people, they miss the dramatic aspect of the yativ. Rick, why is the yativ, why the yativ, the word itself actually means sitting? Why do you suppose?
I don't know. Each of the trope have their own name. Obviously, some it describes what it does. Some it describes what it looks like. So I think yativ comes from yoshev. I think it's from the same root to mean sitting there, and it does sit there in front of the word. But I don't know much of an explanation other than that.
Well, I'll accept that. It sits at the beginning of the word and has that sort of uplifting, startling drama that grabs your attention. But Rick, let's get to the chanting.
Yes.
I suggest that we start with verses 1 through 5, where Isaiah pronounces the redemption of Jerusalem. Then in verses 6 through 8, Isaiah contrasts the fleeting nature of the natural world in contrast to the eternal nature of God. Then verses 9 through 11, we hear the word Hine 3 times. Then we'll move on to verses 12 through 21. And those verses are introduced by the series of questions we talked about. And when we get to the answers in verses 22 through 24, and finally, you'll chant verses 25 and 26, which are the uplifting concluding verses, which exclaim God's greatness as creator of the world that we see.
Okay, so the text is found on page 1033 in our Chumash. But before I start, I know you had some personal thoughts on verses 1 to 5. I heard it last year. I want to hear them again.
I do, Rick. As a transportation planner, I especially like verse 3. Clear a way for Adonai's road, level in the desert a highway for our God. In road building, we have something called cut and fill to level the roadway. Would you read the beginning of verse 4 for me, Rick?
V'haya he'akov lemishor v'harachasim levikah.
Which in our Chumash is translated as, let the rugged ground become level and the ridges become a plain. But I prefer Robert Alter's translation. The crooked shall be made straight and the ridges become a valley. I think that the crooked shall be straight is a great message for our time.
Okay, so trope-wise, we've got a Ger Shayim in verse 2. which calls attention to that word, of course, dabru, speak. And it's tenderly is the way it's translated here. I'm not sure how they get that from that. You have Omer, you have Daber, but here they translate it as tenderly, which okay. And then you have a Zakef Gadol in verse 3 on Bamidbar in the desert, which is a striking trope that stands by itself, how we used to be in the wilderness, and now we're not.
Right. In fact, going back to what I was talking about, this road we're talking about is to be built in the desert. So metaphorically, the people are being brought through the desert to the New Jerusalem. Rick, let's hear the bracha and then chant verses 1 through 5.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomar Elohechem, Dabru, Alev Yerushalayim, Bekiru Elecha, Ki Mal'at Tzva'ach, Ki Nirtza Avonach, Ki Lacha Mi'ad Adonai, Ki Flaim B'chol chatotecha, kol koreh bamidbar, panu derech Adonai, yashru barava, mesila leloheinu, kol get yinaseh, b'chol har v'giva yishpalu, V'haya Yaakov lemishor, v'har chasim levik'ah, v'nigla kevod Adonai, v'ra'u chol basar yachtav, ki Adonai diber.
Very nice. Very nice. Moving on to verses 6 through 8. We already talked about the Yativ at the beginning of verse 6.
Proclaiming, yes?
Sure.
And then you had the thing about the grass.
Right. These verses remind me of a psalm that we recite on Shabbat, Psalm 90, Tefillah LeMoshe Isha Elohim. Both these verses and that psalm liken life to grass and flowers that grow and then dry up and fade, noting the ephemeralness of life in contrast to the eternity of God.
Yes, and then the poetry, the repetition of the phrase Yavesh Kasir, Navel Tzitz. It's just nice. It's just nice stuff.
In verses 7 and 8, right? Those four words are repeated.
Okay.
All right.
So sing.
Sure.
Kol Omer Kra Ve'amar Ma'ekra Kol Habasar Chatzir Ve'chol Chasdo Ketzitz Hasadeh Yavesh Chatzir Navel Tzitz Ki Ruach Adonai Nashva Bo Achein Chatzir Ha'am Yavesh Chatzir Navel Tzitz Udavar Eloheinu Yakum Leolam.
Very nice. Moving on to verses 9 through 11, we have that triple repetition of the word Hine.
Yes, and it's a very biblical word. It behold, it naturally grabs the audience's attention that something's going to happen here, or else they wouldn't have used it. So first time Elohechem, you are God. Second time Adonai Elohim after that, and then Sicharo Ito. So reward is with him, with God. So it's a definite emphasis on where salvation, where reward comes from.
Exactly. The previous verses, we were talking about the frailty of human life and of all life on earth. And here we're talking about the majesty and eternity of God. behold that majesty.
Yeah, harimi is repeated also. I see raise your voice, raise it, have no fear. So again, all sorts of repetition with Isaiah here.
And encouraging verses, very encouraging. All right, verses 9 through 11.
Al hargavo ha'alilach mevaseret Sion harimi v'koach kolech mevaseret Yerushalayim harimi al tirai imri le'arei Yehuda hine Elohechem hine Adonai Elohim bechazak yavo uzra'o moshlalo hine scharo ito ufulato lefanav kiro'eh edro yir'eh bizro'o yikabetz tilaim ucheko yisa alot Yenahel.
Rick, as we move to verse 12, we introduced a series of rhetorical questions. Who measures the waters? Who knows the mind of God? With whom did God consult?
And of course, at the beginning of the section, we have the Kadma v'Azla. I know it's your favorite trope.
Oh yeah,
So,
especially the way you do it.
Thanks. It's brought again to show power and intensity and focus. So especially with the desert people, measuring out water is a very important thing, especially in California, Nevada, Arizona. It's an important thing. And so the trope are highlighting those words there.
I know the question, with whom did God consult, has a special meaning for you.
Right, because I'm into angels, and in creation, in this Genesis story, God created the angels and then consulted with them before people were created. But here it's not like that, and Isaiah at least is saying God has all the decision making and didn't need to consult about what's right and what's wise, the path of wisdom.
There's a note in the Eitz Chaim commentary about how the repeated questioning that appears in these verses confronts us with the unfathomable majesty of God. Why don't you chant through verses 12 through 21, and we'll think about that.
Mimadad b'sholo ma'im v'shamayim fazeret tikein v'cho b'shalish afar ha'aretz v'shakal b'peles harim ugvaot b'moznayim mitikein et ruach Adonai Vishatzato Yodienu et mi noatz vayevinehu vayelamdehu ve'orach mishpat vayelamdehu da'at v'deret v'not Yodienu hengoyim kemar midli uchshachak moznaim nechshavu Heiniyim kadak yitol ulvanon ein de ba'er v'chayato ein de ola kol hagoyim ke'ayin negdo me'efes v'tohu nechshavu lo ve'el mi tadamun el Umadumut ta'archulo hapesel nasach karash v'tzoref bazahav yirakenu urtuko kesef soref hamsukan truma etlo yirkav yivchar charash chakam Yivakesh lo lehachin pesel lo yimot. Halo tedu, halo tishma'u, halo hugad merosh lachem, halo avinotem mostot haaretz. So verse 22.
All right. So I like those hellos in that verse 21, asking those questions once again. But moving on to verse 22, we get answers starting in verses 22 through 24, referring to the power of God and, once again, the ephemeralness of man.
Right. And it doesn't matter that the inhabitants are like grasshoppers. It's all about the off this and off that. Hardly this, hardly that, but God has all the power, and He blows His breath on them, very anthropomorphic, and the storm bears them off. So you don't worry about other problems, other people's in your way. Ultimately, we'll be successful if you stay faithful to God. That whole message.
Well, to me, Rick, part of that message is summed up in that aphorism. I think it's called an aphorism that people say, man plans and God laughs.
Yes, that's a good one. Hayoshev achug haaretz veyoshvecha kachagavim anotech chadok shamayim vayimtachem ka'ohel Lashavet Hanoten Rosnim Le'ayin Shov Teretz Katohu Asa Af Banitau Af Balzorau Af Balshorei Sparetz Gizam Vegam Nashaf Bahem Vayivashu Usara kakash tisaim.
Rick, we conclude with a big question in verse 25, and then the uplifting final answer in the concluding verse of our Haftarah. Can you read from Ve'elmi?
Ve'elmi tidam yuni ve'eshveh.
Right.
Yomar kadosh.
To whom can God be compared? The answer is only indirect. As God is the host of the heavens, the supreme commander of all, far beyond what man can imagine. I interpret the last three words, Ish lo ne'edar, as saying, God cannot be compared to anything that man can imagine. Take us home, Rick.
Ve'elmi tidam yuni ve'eshveh. Yomar kadosh. Sumarom. Einechem ur'u mivara ele hamotzi v'mispar tzva'am lefulam b'shem yikra merov onim v'amitz koach ish lo nedar.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
As always, we want to thank Norm Gar for his great Here's Millie graphics and his music, and for the beautiful text that you'll see on your screen. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your family and friends. I'm heading for the mountains for a little bit of solitude and wilderness davening. We wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and comfort in these trying times. See you next week.
Shabbat Shalom.